The gunshot echoed through the Montana wilderness, sending a flock of startled birds into the late afternoon sky, as Katherine Kane pressed her malnourished body against the wall of the abandoned cabin, her trembling hand covering her son's mouth. The year was 1879, and 3 months had passed since influenza had claimed her husband, leaving her alone with 5-year-old Thomas in a world that showed little mercy to women without men to protect them. "Quiet now, Tommy," she whispered, her voice barely audible as another shot rang out. They mustn't find us. The cabin had been their salvation and prison for the past week. After being forced from their homestead by her late husband's brother, a man whose greed had outweighed any familial obligation, Katherine had fled with only what she could carry. Their food had run out 2 days ago, and the gnawing hunger had become a constant companion, as familiar as the fear that stalked their every moment. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her heart pound wildly against her ribs. She clutched Thomas closer, feeling his small body shaking against hers. The riders stopped outside the cabin. Katherine could hear men's voices, rough and unfamiliar, and the creak of saddle leather. "Check the cabin," a voice ordered. "Might be something worth taking." Heavy boots thudded on the wooden porch. Katherine looked frantically around the single room, but there was nowhere to hide. The door swung open, sunlight slicing through the gloom to reveal a tall silhouette framed in the doorway. Thomas whimpered, and Katherine pulled him behind her skirts as she faced the intruder, her blue eyes wide with terror but her chin held high. "Please," she said, her voice cracking, "don't hurt us. We have nothing of value." The man stepped fully into the cabin, and she could see him clearly now, a rugged cowboy with a weathered face and eyes the color of a summer storm. A revolver hung at his side, but his hand made no move toward it. Instead, those gray eyes assessed her and the child with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "I'm not here to hurt you, madam," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I'll protect you forever if need be." Lucas Calloway had been tracking rustlers for 3 days when he'd come across the dilapidated cabin. The local ranchers had banded together to stop the theft of their cattle, and as the most skilled tracker among them, Lucas had volunteered to hunt down the thieves. The last thing he'd expected to find was a starving woman and child hiding in the wilderness. "Who's out there with you?" Katherine asked, still positioning herself between Thomas and the stranger. "Just me and some men from the Circle G ranch," Lucas answered, removing his hat and holding it respectfully against his chest. "We're tracking cattle thieves, not looking to cause any trouble for folks just trying to survive." Katherine's legs weakened with relief, and she nearly collapsed before catching herself on the edge of a rickety table. The movement brought Lucas forward in concern. "Madam, you don't look well. When's the last time you ate?" She hesitated, pride warring with desperation. 2 days ago." "We had some jerky, but it's gone now." Lucas nodded, his expression solemn. "Wait here," he said, then stepped back outside. Katherine heard him speaking to the other men, his voice too low for her to make out the words. A moment later, he returned with a saddlebag. "I've got some provisions to share," he said, pulling out a cloth-wrapped package of cornbread, dried beef, and a canteen of water. "It's not much, but it'll tide you over." Katherine's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." "Lucas Calloway," he supplied, setting the food on the table. "And you are Katherine Kane. This is my son, Thomas." She nudged the boy forward, and he peered up at Lucas with wary eyes. Lucas crouched down to Thomas's level. "Pleased to meet you, Thomas. That's a fine name for a brave young man." The boy didn't respond, but his grip on his mother's skirt loosened slightly. "Mrs. Kane, if you don't mind my asking, what brings you out here alone? This isn't safe country for a woman and child." Katherine's face hardened. "My husband's brother claimed our homestead after James died of influenza. Said the land was rightfully his since James had no sons of age to inherit. We had nowhere else to go." Lucas's jaw tightened with anger, but he kept his voice even for the boy's sake. "That's not right. The law would be on your side." The law is 3 days' ride from here, Mr. Calloway, and Samuel Kane has friends at the land office. She began carefully dividing the food, giving the larger portion to Thomas. Lucas watched her, noting the hollows in her cheeks and the way her dress hung loosely on her frame. She was starving herself to keep her son fed, and even that wasn't enough. "I can't leave you here," he decided aloud. "The nearest town is Silver Creek, a day's ride south. I've got a small place just outside it. You and your boy can stay there while I finish this job." Katherine stiffened. "I couldn't impose, it's no imposition, Mrs. Kane. It's what any decent man would do." Lucas glanced toward the door. "The men I'm with will be wanting to move on. We've lost daylight tracking, and those rustlers are getting further away, but I won't leave you here to starve." Katherine looked down at Thomas, who was devouring the cornbread with desperate intensity. The maternal instinct to protect her child warred with her caution about trusting a stranger. But what choice did she have? "All right, Mr. Calloway, we'll accept your help for now." Lucas nodded, satisfied. "I'll let the others know. They can continue the tracking without me. I'll take you and Thomas to Silver Creek tonight." When Lucas returned from speaking with his companions, he found Katherine had packed her meager belongings, a change of clothes for herself and Thomas, a worn Bible, and a daguerreotype of a smiling man who must have been her husband. "Is this everything?" Lucas asked, surprised by how little they had. "Everything worth taking," she confirmed, helping Thomas into his threadbare coat. Lucas led them outside to where his horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding, waited patiently. "My horse can carry all 3 of us to Silver Creek. He's strong enough." He lifted Thomas onto the saddle first, then offered his hand to Katherine. She hesitated before taking it, and Lucas couldn't help but notice how delicate her fingers felt despite the calluses that spoke of hard work. He swung himself up behind them, reaching around Katherine to take the reins, acutely aware of how she stiffened at their proximity. "I'll keep a respectful distance, Mrs. Kane," he assured her quietly, "but I need to be able to control the horse." She nodded, relaxing slightly but still holding herself rigidly straight. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway, for everything." The journey to Silver Creek took longer than Lucas had anticipated. They had to travel slowly due to the horse's triple burden, and Katherine's exhaustion necessitated frequent stops. By the time they reached Lucas's small ranch on the outskirts of town, the first light of dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon. The cabin was modest but well-maintained, with a small corral for horses and a vegetable garden that had seen better days due to Lucas's absence. Inside was simple, a main room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with chairs, and a curtained-off area that served as Lucas's bedroom. "You and Thomas can take the bed," Lucas said, lighting a lamp. "I'll sleep out here by the fire." Katherine surveyed the cabin, noting its cleanliness and order. "This is very kind of you, Mr. Calloway." "Lucas, please," he said, setting their few belongings on the table. "I'll fetch some water and start a fire. You both should rest." While Katherine settled Thomas in the bed, Lucas busied himself with practical matters, bringing in firewood, heating water, and preparing a simple breakfast of oatmeal and the last of his preserved peaches. He moved quietly, aware of the exhausted pair behind the curtain. When Katherine emerged an hour later, her face washed and her hair neatly combed, Lucas was struck again by her quiet dignity. Despite her circumstances, there was a strength in her bearing that commanded respect. "Thomas is still sleeping," she said, approaching the fire. "I thought I might help with something." "The best help would be for you to eat and regain your strength," Lucas replied, gesturing to the table where he'd laid out breakfast. "I need to tend to my horse and check the property, but I'll be close by if you need anything." Over the next few days, a routine developed. Lucas would rise early to care for his horse and the few chickens he kept, while Katherine took charge of the cabin, cooking meals from the supplies Lucas had and mending clothes that had long needed attention. Thomas, initially shy and withdrawn, began to follow Lucas around the small ranch, watching with fascination as the cowboy repaired fences and tended to other chores. A week after their arrival, Lucas found Katherine sitting on the porch step in the evening light, her hands idle for once as she gazed at the distant mountains. "May I join you?" he asked, and at her nod settled beside her, careful to maintain a proper distance. "Thomas is becoming quite attached to you," she observed, a note of concern in her voice. "He's a good boy. Smart, too, been helping me with the chickens." Katherine smiled faintly. "His father would be proud." She paused, then added, "I need to start thinking about what comes next, Mr. Calloway." "Lucas," he corrected gently, "and there's no rush. Winter's coming and traveling with a child would be difficult. I can't impose on your kindness indefinitely." Lucas considered his next words carefully. "It's no imposition. Truth be told, this place has felt more like a home with you and Thomas here than it ever did before." Katherine looked at him sharply, searching his face for any sign of impropriety, but found only sincerity in his gray eyes. "I don't want charity," she said finally. "It's not charity to help a neighbor in need. Besides, you've more than earned your keep with the cooking and mending." He gestured to his shirt, which she had patched so skillfully the repair was nearly invisible. "I've eaten better this past week than in the 2 years I've lived here." That drew a genuine laugh from her, the first he'd heard, and the sound warmed something in Lucas that had been cold for a very long time. As October gave way to November, the first snow dusted the mountains, and life at the small ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. Lucas made trips into Silver Creek for supplies, always returning with something extra: a piece of candy for Thomas, a length of calico for Katherine, small tokens that he presented casually, but which meant the world to the recipients. Katherine found herself watching for Lucas's return on these days, and Thomas would run to meet him, eager to share the day's discoveries. The boy who had been so traumatized by loss and hunger was blossoming under Lucas's gentle guidance, learning to care for animals and helping with simple ranch tasks. One evening, as the three of them sat around the table after supper, Thomas looked up from the wooden horse Lucas had carved for him and asked innocently, "Mr. Lucas, are you going to be my new pa?" The question hung in the air, and Katherine felt heat rush to her face. "Thomas." "That's not an appropriate question." Lucas, to his credit, didn't appear flustered. "That's something that would be up to your ma, Thomas, and it's not a decision folks make lightly." Thomas nodded, satisfied with the answer, and returned to his toy, unaware of the charged atmosphere he'd created. Later, after Thomas was asleep, Katherine approached Lucas as he sat by the fire, cleaning his revolver. "I apologize for Thomas's question," she said quietly. "Children don't understand certain boundaries." Lucas set the weapon aside. "No need to apologize. It's natural for a boy to want a father figure." Katherine sat in the chair opposite him, her hands folded in her lap. "I've been thinking about what you said about winter making travel difficult. You're right, of course, but come spring, Thomas and I should move on. Is that what you want?" Lucas asked, his voice carefully neutral. Katherine looked into the flames, considering her answer. "What I want is security for my son, a place where we can build a life without fear." "You could have that here," Lucas said, then quickly added, "I mean in Silver Creek. The town's growing and they need a schoolteacher. I heard the current one's getting married and moving to Denver." Katherine's eyes widened. "A schoolteacher? I did teach briefly before I married James. Then it might be perfect for you. The position comes with living quarters above the schoolhouse. You and Thomas would have your own place." The possibility of independence, of earning her own way, was tempting. Yet the thought of leaving the ranch, of not seeing Lucas each day, created an unexpected ache in her chest. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "Thank you for thinking of us." The first major snowfall came in early December, blanketing the landscape in white and effectively isolating the ranch for several days. During this time, the three of them grew closer still, sharing stories by the firelight and teaching Thomas to read from Lucas's small collection of books. On Christmas Eve, Lucas surprised them with gifts: a handsome coat for Thomas made from one of his own that he'd carefully cut down, and for Katherine, a journal bound in soft leather. I noticed you writing sometimes, using scraps of paper, he explained as she ran her fingers over the cover. Thought you might like something proper to write in. It's beautiful, she whispered, touched by his thoughtfulness. Thank you, Lucas. After Thomas was asleep that night, they sat together on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in blankets and watching the stars that sparkled in the clear winter sky. I went to see about that teaching position, Katherine admitted quietly. The town council was amenable, especially when I mentioned I was staying with you. You seem well respected in Silver Creek. Lucas nodded, pleased but not surprised. When do you start, after the new year? They're preparing the quarters for us now. She turned to look at him directly. I can never repay you for what you've done for us, Lucas. I don't want repayment, he said, his voice husky with emotion. Seeing you and Thomas safe and happy is enough. Katherine reached out impulsively and placed her hand over his. You've become important to me. The admission hung between them, fragile as a snowflake. Lucas turned his hand to clasp hers, the simple contact sending warmth through both of them despite the winter chill. Katherine, he began, then stopped, searching for the right words. I haven't felt this way about anyone in a very long time. I know it might be too soon after your loss, and I would never presume. It's not too soon, she interrupted softly. James would want Thomas and me to be happy, and you, Lucas Calloway, make us very happy. Lucas's smile was slow and tender as he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Then perhaps, with time, we could see where this leads. January brought the start of Katherine's new position at the Silver Creek School. Each morning, Lucas would drive her and Thomas into town with his wagon, and each afternoon he would be waiting to bring them home despite the living quarters above the schoolhouse. They had all tacitly agreed that the ranch remained their true home. The townsfolk watched this arrangement with interest, and soon speculation about Lucas Calloway and the widow Kane became a favorite topic of conversation at the general store and the saloon. Most approved, seeing the positive change in the usually solitary Cowboy, though a few raised eyebrows at the propriety of the situation. Katherine became aware of the gossip when Martha Wilson, the wife of the general store owner, approached her after school one day. Mrs. Kane, I hope you don't mind my speaking plainly, the older woman began, but folks are talking about you and Mr. Calloway. Katherine felt her cheeks warm. Mr. Calloway has been a good friend to me and my son, Mrs. Wilson. Oh, I don't doubt that. He's a fine man. But a woman in your position must be careful of her reputation. Martha's expression was kind but concerned. Have you considered that his intentions might be more than friendship? Katherine met the woman's gaze steadily. I have, Mrs. Wilson, and if Mr. Calloway were to express such intentions formally, I would welcome them. Martha nodded, satisfied. Well then, I'll say no more on the matter, except that Silver Creek could use more families like yours would be. The conversation stayed with Katherine as she waited for Lucas that afternoon. When his wagon appeared at the end of the street, Thomas ran to meet him as usual, but Katherine hung back, watching the interaction between her son and the man who had saved them both in more ways than one. Lucas lifted Thomas onto the wagon seat, laughing at something the boy said, then looked up and caught Katherine's eye. The smile he gave her, then warm, intimate, full of promise, made her decision clear in her heart. That evening, after Thomas was asleep, Katherine found Lucas on the porch, despite the cold February air. You'll catch your death out here, she admonished gently, joining him with a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Just thinking, he replied, making room for her on the bench. About what? Lucas turned to face her, his expression serious. About us. About what happens next. Katherine's heart quickened. And what do you think happens next? I think, he said slowly, that I'd like to ask you to marry me. But I'm afraid it's too soon, or that you might feel obligated because of all that's happened. Katherine reached for his hand, entwining their fingers. Lucas Calloway, I have never felt obligated to you. Grateful, yes, indebted perhaps at first, but what I feel now is something else entirely. And what's that? he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Love," she said simply. "I love you, and so does Thomas." Lucas's face transformed with joy. He cupped her cheek with his free hand, his touch gentle as if she were made of porcelain. "I love you too, Katherine Kane." "More than I thought possible after all this time alone." "Then ask me," she urged, her eyes shining in the moonlight. Lucas slid from the bench to one knee before her, still holding her hand. "Katherine, will you and Thomas do me the honor of becoming my family? Will you marry me?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, we will." Their wedding took place in April, when the wildflowers dotted the plains with color and the promise of new life filled the air. The entire town of Silver Creek turned out for the occasion, the schoolhouse decorated with ribbons and flowers, and Thomas proudly carrying the rings on a small velvet cushion. Katherine wore a dress of pale blue, simply cut but elegant, with wildflowers in her hair. Lucas, unaccustomed to formal attire, looked handsome if somewhat uncomfortable in a new suit, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion. When they spoke their vows, Lucas added a promise of his own, one that echoed the words he'd spoken in that abandoned cabin months before. "I'll protect you forever, Katherine, you and Thomas both." The celebration afterward was joyful, with music and dancing and enough food to feed the town twice over. As evening fell, the newlyweds and Thomas returned to the ranch, their ranch now, legally and in every other way that mattered. Later that night, with Thomas asleep and the house quiet, Lucas held Katherine close in their bed, marveling at the turn his life had taken. "I never thought I'd have this," he confessed, tracing the curve of her cheek with his fingertips. "A family, a woman to love who loves me back." Katherine kissed him softly. "When James died, I thought my life was over. I never imagined finding love again, especially not in such desperate circumstances." "Sometimes the darkest moments lead us to the brightest light," Lucas said, surprising her with his poetic turn of phrase. "When did you know," she asked, "that you loved me?" Lucas considered the question. "I think it started that first day when you stood in that cabin, half-starved but still defiant, protecting your son. But I knew for certain the first time I heard you laugh." Katherine smiled at the memory. "For me, it was watching you with Thomas. Seeing how patient and kind you were with him even when you had no obligation to be. He's a fine boy, smart as a whip and brave as they come, like his mother." Lucas's expression grew serious. "Katherine, I want you to know that I'll never try to replace James in his life, but I'll be the best father I can be to him." "You already are," she assured him, resting her head on his chest. "James would approve, I think. He only ever wanted us to be safe and happy. And are you happy?" Katherine lifted her head to look into his eyes. "Happier than I ever thought possible." 5 years later, the Calloway ranch had grown considerably. With Lucas's skill as a cattleman and Katherine's careful management of their finances, they had purchased additional land and increased their herd. The small cabin had been expanded to accommodate their growing family. Thomas, now 10, had been joined by 3-year-old Sarah and 1-year-old James, named for the father Thomas still remembered in quiet moments. Katherine had continued teaching until Sarah's birth, then decided to focus on raising their children and helping with the ranch. Her experience with education hadn't gone to waste, however. She taught all the children on the ranch and neighboring homesteads when the weather made traveling to town impossible. On the anniversary of their first meeting, Lucas and Katherine made a tradition of riding out alone together, leaving the children with Martha Wilson, who had become like a grandmother to them. They would visit the site of the abandoned cabin where Lucas had found Katherine and Thomas, a pilgrimage of sorts to honor the beginning of their journey together. This year, as they approached the clearing where the cabin had once stood, now collapsed entirely under the weight of several harsh winters, Lucas dismounted and helped Katherine down from her horse. "Hard to believe it's been 6 years," he said, holding her close as they surveyed the ruins. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Katherine replied, leaning into his embrace. "Other times it's as if I've always been with you." Lucas turned her to face him. You saved me as much as I saved you, you know. I was just existing before you and Thomas came into my life, not really living. Katherine reached up to trace the lines at the corners of his eyes, evidence of years spent in the sun but also of laughter and joy. We saved each other then. I'd say that's about right. He kissed her tenderly, then reached into his saddlebag. I have something for you. He handed her a small wooden box, simply but beautifully made. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a locket of gold, its surface engraved with intertwining vines. Lucas, it's beautiful, she gasped, opening it to find miniature portraits of their children inside. Open the back, he urged gently. Katherine turned the locket over, finding a small catch she hadn't noticed. When she pressed it, a hidden compartment opened, revealing words engraved in the gold. I'll protect you forever. Tears filled her eyes as she looked up at him. You've kept that promise every day. And I always will, Lucas vowed, helping her fasten the locket around her neck. You, Thomas, Sarah, James, you're my whole world, Katherine Kalloway. As they rode back to the ranch, where their children waited and the life they had built together continued to flourish, Katherine reflected on the strange and wonderful journey that had brought her to this moment. From the depths of despair and hunger, she had found not just safety and security, but a love that sustained her soul as surely as food nourished her body. The Montana sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson as they crested the final hill before their property came into view. The house, no longer a simple cabin but a proper home, stood strong against the backdrop of mountains, smoke curling invitingly from the chimney. In the yard, Martha Wilson could be seen with the children, Thomas helping his younger siblings feed the chickens while baby James toddled after them. Look, Lucas said, pointing to the scene below. That's what it's all about, isn't it? That right there, Katherine nodded, her heart full beyond measure. Yes, that's exactly what it's all about. They urged their horses forward, eager to rejoin their family, the promise of forever stretching out before them like the vast Montana sky, boundless, beautiful, and filled with possibility.